Okay, now it's working. Now it is working. Hello, beautiful, amazing, thoughtful, curious people. This is episode 25 of Stand Up, and today I welcome former journalist and now hilarious stand-up comedian and author, Chloe Hilliard. Today's question, do you know what black girl magic is? Welcome to the classroom of life that is Stand Up with Pete Dominick, where every show I do my best to fight apathy and ignorance and learn together with you from my expert guests and other awesome, smart, entertaining, thoughtful people about the issues and ideas that matter to you. Your family, your community, your country, your soul, your planet, your own personal well-being. We will figure out this roller coaster we call life together. This past weekend, I was performing at Gotham Comedy Club, where today's guest was headlining for the first time, and I really enjoyed watching her perform. She connected with a very diverse cross-section of audience that Gotham is always known for having. She absolutely killed. I've never seen her stand up. I was blown away watching her work. Really good. Very talented, smart, and hilarious. And at the top of our chat here, I asked her how she defined black girl magic. Her answer was really thoughtful, and I decided to make that today's question. So after my talk with Chloe Hilliard, I'll read you the responses I got from black women who I'm social media friends with to define black girl magic through their eyes. And they gave great answers, so definitely be sure to listen to the end of that. And also a bonus rant I have against our shitty healthcare system, which I posted on my social media. I'll also read your responses to that as well. But first, this will be the last time I'll be promoting my show in Charleston, South Carolina, which is Saturday the 18th, tomorrow night if you're listening on Friday when this podcast episode first drops. The Wolf Street Playhouse, there's a link in the show notes. Few tickets still available. Looking forward to headlining the Charleston Comedy Festival. Finally, if you haven't posted a rating on the podcast, please take a moment to do that. One of the primary ways to build an audience. As always, please consider a paid subscription to the podcast on patreon.com. We have almost 300 people now paying, and that's awesome. If I can double that, I think we can get to 5 days a week. It takes a lot of time. I'm doing this almost entirely alone. So maybe we can get to 5 days a week and find a way to be live, maybe every day, maybe a couple times a week, video, lots more, but I need the resources to do it. I really want to commit fully to this as much as I can. So patreon.com/Pete Dominick. And now my conversation with hilarious comedian and author. Her new book is Fuck Your Diet and Other Things My Thighs Tell Me. Follow her on social media at Chloe_Hilliard. ChloéHilliard.com on her website. Here it is, Chloe Hilliard. I am hitting record. You ready?
I'm ready.
So here she is now. Very excited to have her, Chloe Hilliard. Chloe, thank you so much for doing this. I'm so excited to have you on this show.
Absolutely. I'm glad we can make it work.
Yes. Congratulations on the book. I want to get into all of it and talk about all of it, but let's jump right in. I'm going to ask you one specific question right here, which is, I hear this phrase a lot. I think I kind of have my own definition. Is it a phrase or just a group of words? What is black girl magic?
Black girl magic. It's a phrase that was made popular and coined a couple years ago. And basically, my interpretation of it is that whenever you have a person or a group that is oppressed or overlooked or undermined or objectified, that group normally has to come up with its own mantra, its own affirmations. And prior to Black Girl Magic, what was commonly said within our community was like, I'm a strong black woman. And you say this, it's like looking in a mirror and saying, I'm a strong black woman, despite all the things that are working against me in society and cultural norms, to give yourself that self-confidence. And that's why people think black women have this innate ability to be confident and self-reliant. And that's something that we are taught to be over time, even from childhood. And so it becomes a way of life. It becomes a mentality, but it's really essentially, in my opinion, it's really a defense mechanism to help us cope with the world. And so now the new revamping of that is Black Girl Magic, which is let's find the essence of who we are. Let's find, the magic and what makes us unique, because as we see, especially in social media, a lot of the attributes, physical attributes that Black women naturally have, we were told that it doesn't look good. We shouldn't do those things. things, and now everybody's copying those things. And so where's our recognition? Where's our validation in that? And so you have to just say, clearly, I must be a magical person because the things that are natural to me, people are now aspiring towards. So Black Girl Magic is like the essence of all things that are, that make us who we are, make us unique.
Okay, so when you say that we are taught to, I think you said, be confident or be resilient. Forgive me if it's not exactly what you said. Is that something that you're taught directly, like your mother or your father even, or other role models say, you've got to be this, you've got to be that? Or is it something that you're taught through role modeling or informally, or is it all of them?
I think I don't want to generalize for everybody's experience, but for me particularly, it was taught to me and it was both verbalized to me and also shown to me. In the Black family, the matriarch runs the show. The Black woman runs the show. You have the grandmother figure who oversees everything. And of course, if there is a patriarch, they were there as well. But the mother, my grandmother ran the house. My grandmother took care of everything. And I remember her saying to me, she goes, when you get into a relationship, when you get married, he should pay for the house, but you take care of everything in the house. And that meant literally everything within the house. And so that's what I was shown as a young girl. And I spent a lot of my young years with my grandmother, and she just took care of everything. And she was the sounding board. She was the advice person. She took care of everything. My grandfather worked and he paid, for the mortgage, but she did everything else. She raised the kids. I mean, he was there, but it was what she said, So if it was like, Grandpa, can we do this? He would go, what did Grandma say? So she was the de facto judge and jury. And so she was so strong and confident in who she was. And that's what I saw. And then my mom, taking up after my grandmother, she always just instilled in me to just be self-reliant, don't depend on anybody. And I think the idea of not depending on someone, it's so a part of the Black woman experience because for, decades, if not centuries, the issue of the Black man and the Black woman has been something that's been controversial because if you go back to like slavery days, you can say that the Black family wasn't allowed to be a family because they were still owned by someone else, and that, a marriage could be dissolved or you had to get permission to be married. So there were so many things, even if you look during like the 60s and 70s when it came to welfare, like if a woman was on public assistance, she couldn't have a man living in the house. So there was so many things that undermined the Black family unit. So that as a result of that, we as a Black woman were just told, you have to be self-sufficient. You have to be strong because, you may or may not find a mate. And if you find a mate, there's so many things that come into play when it comes to like the breaking down of the family unit and the Black community after, years, like hundreds of years of systematic oppression. So it's a lot of things that we carry. And I realized that my experience especially when it comes to dating and men, it's very different from like my white girlfriends who I went to school with. And when we sit and have conversations, it's just like things that they take for granted, we don't take for granted when it comes to like finding a mate.
Do you always is there always a sense of solidarity with Black women? Do you feel comfortable making generalizations about Black women? Those are two separate questions.
Well, I think now it's not smart to make generalizations because everybody's, put it like this, say 20 years ago, it would be easier to make a generalization because you could have said safely, the Black experiences in America is you go to church and the religion was a big factor in your upbringing and all of that stuff. But now I think that we've kind of grown away from the Black church being like the cornerstone of like family values and community action. And a lot of people are finding their own paths. You have people that are seeking out different forms of like spirituality. You have people who are just, shunning the expected roles that they're supposed to have. Gender roles are being questioned and traditions being, so it's a lot of things now that people are we're no longer necessarily operating like a monolith. And so I think it's a little bit harder to say generally speak for all, Black women.
Let me ask you another race-related question. Of course, I want to get into the book and body image and comedy and journalism and economics and everything that you write about. But because I had this conversation with my 14-year-old daughter maybe 2 days ago, and you're the first Black person I've had a thoughtful conversation with since, I want to ask you how you handle it. And I performed with you this weekend, so I know, kind of your take on it to some extent, or at least how you use it. It's about the N-word. So my daughter says, I was explaining to her that, generally speaking, the way I look at sexism and racism is if women are all telling me that I'm sexist or what I said was sexist, if a bunch of women are saying that, then I need to probably consider my behavior or what I said, the way I handled that. If people of color are saying, well, that was racist or you're a racist, then of course I would have to consider, well, what did I do? What did I say? It would be arrogant otherwise not to. So we were explaining that, and she said, well, how come I hear so many Black kids in school using the N-word? And how come it's okay when they use it? And I said, oh, all right, well, that's a different conversation. But I said it's about taking back the word. It's about owning the word, and all. I'm trying to muddle through it. And I performed with you over the weekend, and you use that word, and I laugh when you use it on stage in your act. You're usually talking about stories about men and how you're responding to them, and it's really funny and interesting. But I almost felt guilt laughing at it sometimes when I hear it. But what would you say to my daughter, and what is your relationship with the word?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I definitely use the word in casual conversation. And whenever I say the word on stage, it's because I'm in I've reached a certain level of comfort where the joke, the material is now like more conversational than me reciting a joke, if that makes any sense. So like, if you hear me say it on stage, it's because I'm just like in a flow. It's not written in any of my jokes. It's not a big punchline. It's not like, okay, this is where I say it, like I wrote it down this way. It just comes out naturally, and then I have to catch myself like, oh, okay, I just said the N-word. And sometimes I'll say it like to the audience, like, yeah, I know I've said the N-word. Don't get weird. Like, when I'm saying it, I'm referring to like all this group of people, not just race specific. Like, and I'll joke and I'll be like, yeah, white people, I'll call white people nigga too, like whatever, so it's just like, because that's just like my train of thought at the moment. But I do agree with you. I think it has been a long-standing thing in the Black community where we've kind of like try to take the bite out of it, and you've just kind of repurposed it. It's kind of, to me, along the same lines of hearing now that the LGBTQ community has like embraced and rebranded queer. And so I have a joke about that, which is like, my brother told me that they don't say gay anymore, they say queer. And I'm like, well, where I grew up, you didn't call somebody queer unless you wanted to fight. And so I think you see instances of oppressed or marginalized groups trying to take back the power of a word that's been used to inflict pain and conflict. And I believe that it's that group's right to do that. I don't think it's anyone else's right to say, oh, you can't do that because it makes me uncomfortable. It's like, well, this word has been making me uncomfortable, and now I've just reupholstered it, and now it's a cute piece of furniture in my living room, and you can't say anything about it.
What about identity politics? I just had a guy who's running for Congress on the show. He's Black and he's gay. And I mentioned that in a tweet. He mentions it, frankly, like his opening sentence in his bio. His name is Mondaire Jones. He's really, really smart. He went to Stanford. He went to Harvard. But he opens with it in his own biography. He's a Black gay man running for Congress. And someone, pings me on Twitter, is like, why does that matter? You're race baiting. And I said, and my answer, Chloe, is the vessel that you travel your life through matters. It matters. Absolutely. If you're a man or if you're a woman. It matters if you're gay, straight. It matters. Your ethnicity, your religion matters. Your experience in life matters to how you see things. Frankly, I always admire people who overcome adversity, any kind of adversity, whether you're disabled or whether you're discriminated against minority. I always admire those people as opposed to somebody who we say is born on third base with all the privilege and resources and opportunity. That, to me, it's not their fault, but that's not as admirable that you accomplished this or that because you started way ahead. How do you see kind of identity politics, or how do you look at, say, a political candidate or even a manager at Taco Bell being a black woman or being a gay person or being someone with cerebral palsy? Doesn't that experience matter?
It absolutely does. And I think when people want to downplay that, they're basically saying that I don't want to acknowledge that your life is any different than mine because then I'd have to admit that I have privilege. And so a lot of times people try to undermine someone's race or gender identity because they don't want to come to terms with the fact that the world is not fair for everyone. Mm-hmm. And of course, those things play a role. And if we lived in a utopian world, someone would say, you know what, your experience as a black person or a queer person brings another viewpoint to the table that I and everybody else who's like me doesn't have. So let's sit down and hear what new thing you can contribute to society. But people who are in control, the people who are fighting and voting against their own best interests to maintain some level of supremacy, don't want to value other people who they've been convinced don't bring anything to the table.
And let's talk about one of the, a perfect situation that illustrates what you just said from your own life and your book, which is really great. And we were talking about this the other night, but you got a job out of college. You went to NYU, really smart in school and went to a great college, and you got a degree in journalism, right? And when you got hired at Lifetime magazine, which was a magazine that came out of, at the time, the most popular cable network, right? You kind of were hired, forgive me if I get this wrong, but as a diversity hire. Like, they had seemingly, if I get this wrong, just correct it all, but they had good intentions in that they wanted more diversity on their staff, and it was mostly white women. And so they bring you on, but yet then they didn't, it's like they only went halfway. They bring you on, but then they don't value your experience when it matters the most. Do I have that remotely right?
Absolutely. I think that's the case. So I write about it in my book, and I used to joke about it, which is like I was fortunate enough to live and be an adult or young adult in the time of what I call the diversity decade. From 1998 to 2008, I call that the diversity decade. That's when everybody was pushing forward with diversity initiatives and, conferences and symposiums and people coming in and talking about diversity. And it all stopped when Obama won, because everybody, white America, was like, oh, well, they did it. They got a black president, so we don't need to keep having these like HR conference calls about diversity. And so during that time, which is like when I graduated high school and went to college, that it was a big thing. It's like everybody was pushing for diversity. But what I realized is that they just wanted the look of diversity. They didn't want diversity of thought. They just wanted physical people who look different. But the mind, the groupthink mentality is like, well, we all need to be lock and step. And what the initiative is for this magazine, which is appealing to the middle American mom. And when you voice any opinion that's different than that, even though it could have some value, it's definitely like pushed aside because they don't want that conflict. They consider it they consider you saying anything that isn't what they believe to be a conflict. It's a personal attack on them. And I had to learn that the hard way, which is like, no, just because I say a viewpoint doesn't mean I hate your guts and I want to burn the building down. Like, stop taking it personal. like they would take everything personally, like, well, why can't we get along? And it's like, no, we are getting along. We're just having a spirited conversation. And also, I was a junior level staffer. I was an editorial assistant, and it just looked really good for them because I came from NYU. I interned at the Source magazine. I was Black. I was from Brooklyn. And so that it ticked all the boxes. So when they would introduce me, it would be like, oh, this is Chloe, and she interned at the Source magazine. My son loves hip hop. And you're just like, oh, Lord.
What other kinds? What other kind of things, like moments, examples like that happened either at that magazine or even still happen where it's almost like, again, do you think that they have good intentions and they're just really ignorant? And they have no idea how that's coming off. Are you able to see it that way? Or do you look at them like, you should know better?
I mean, I look at them and I say you should know better, but I also realize that my experience with white women is that they have been coddled and protected and cradled by society. Generally, they still, in my experience, they still subscribe to the patriarchy. I mean, up until recently with like Me Too movement and Time's Up, but like they still fall in line with, I'm going to marry a man. I know he's going to make way more money than me. I'm going to have some level of financial comfort, like that is what their life is. And, the women who buck against that are even viewed by their own as like, heretics. Like, how dare you go against like what the fairy tale is, And so I think a lot of times they don't even realize what they are perpetuating because it's just been their norm. It's just what's understood.
That's really interesting. I never really heard it put that way. But you're now generalizing about white women. Certainly, there are a lot of very powerful, influential white women in the U.S. Senate or in media or that don't subscribe to the patriarchy and never have. You'd agree to that, but you're generalizing, right?
I am generalizing.
You're talking about the 53% of white women who voted for Trump. Absolutely.
And that's why Hillary Clinton lost, because she was a threat to their ideal of what life was supposed to be.
That's I think that's so true. I've heard that before, but the way that you put it in this context of patriarchy and race I haven't quite maybe heard it articulated that way. And so that really is fascinating. But I'm sorry, but real quick, that's also the difference. Like I say, when I look at my white girlfriends and myself, it's like we weren't taught in my community. We weren't taught to have a man, like wait for a man to make this amount of money and like get married and just like fall into the family circle, because the reality is black male unemployment is high. The difference in pay scale is different. So even if I were to marry a successful black man, he's still going to make much less than a white man, and I'm making less than both of them. So even though we're married and we have good jobs, we're not really technically middle class because of just the pay scale discrepancy. So it's like all these other things. It's like I can do everything that my white woman counterpart does, and I'll still have to work twice as hard because financially and systematically things are just set up differently. How do you think that dynamic has played out for you in the 10 years that you've been doing comedy?
Well, I mean, I haven't dated really since I started comedy. I had a boyfriend when I first started, and ever since he and I broke up, I just had to focus on my
well, I
my
actually
career.
meant I'm interested in that, but I actually meant in terms of your career, in terms of white, female comedians or white comedians in general. As a black female comedian, how do you feel about the opportunities that you have and the money that you make? I mean, I look at you and say, boy, she's actually done better than the vast majority of comedians in year 3 or something. You really started making money and you've been supporting yourself doing comedy for a long time. Like, I feel like you're above average, or, you've done better than most people who even try it at this game.
Yeah, I
It's probably
that,
not typical.
and I agree. Yes, it's not typical, but also it is because it's like, it is kind of like the twilight zone when it comes to comedy. So I've been able to be successful and financially stable because of my diversity, because I did a lot of colleges. And since I did a lot of colleges, they need to check off boxes. And so I would get hired, especially during Black History Month and Women's History Month. I would be packed out, sold out, gone for both months.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah.
And so I'm a twofer, and that's why I was able to make so much money being a college comedian, because they still have to subscribe to filling out a well-balanced curriculum for the student body.
The other thing that you mentioned, since you're talking about performing at colleges and we are having this conversation, I did that a lot early on in my career, and I really enjoyed it. I like traveling and so on, but I know that you did as well, and I know that you made a lot of money and you booked a lot of colleges and were really successful doing it. But you were telling me that I guess was it during the 2016, during the campaign when Trump was running and becoming the nominee, you really started to feel uncomfortable, or do I dare say unsafe, because you were in the whitest, most rural states doing those colleges, traveling around, eating in those restaurants, staying in those hotels, and performing for those on those campuses where there was very little diversity in these rural states like North Dakota and Wyoming. You write about this in the book, but we were talking about it. Talk to me about specifically, how you felt uncomfortable. And I think you even said you didn't want to do that anymore.
Yeah, I definitely told my college agents, like after, before he won, I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't be out for this many dates by myself because I just felt uncomfortable. And I had started, doing colleges in like 2012, 2013. And it was cool. It was fun. It was an adventure. It was getting to see America. People were nice. Everybody smiled. And then once he was in the primary, you just started seeing these huge Trump flags everywhere. I mean, massive signs in cornfields. And I would have to drive from one state to another because I would do a stretch of shows. I'd be gone for 2-3 weeks straight. And I would fly into a city and then just drive around to all my shows. And I would be on the road for hours at a time by myself. And I would just see sign after sign. I would, call my friends at home and text them like, listen, y'all, they out here. Like they are not, it's not a joke. He's not a joke to them. Like he is the real deal, even though. And also, not just as a Black person, but like also as a native New Yorker, I know his legacy as like a caricature and like a media whore and like, a shady businessman. So on that level, I'm like, y'all don't even know this is a straight up con man that y'all are like, raising your babies to be kissed by. Like you have no idea who this man is. So even on that level, I was, yeah. So it just like blew my mind. It was so surreal.
But that's different. I mean, I understand what you're saying because I understand what it represents. The flag, the billboard, and so on. But did people's behavior change? Did you feel? Were there instances where it was straight up racism or subtleties? Or
it was a lot of subtleties. See, the two things would happen. Either I would walk around, I would be in a establishment, a restaurant, or like a Walmart, and it would be like, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" Which I've gotten, I get because these are not like areas populated by a lot of Black people, so I understand that. But it would be. Before it would be like, oh, where are you from? Versus being like, well, what are you doing here? Like a legit question, like, why are you here? And then I realized like, because people's first interaction with me would be seeing me perform after the show, they would talk to me like I wasn't a Black person because they had watched me. So now they knew who I was. Now they could identify with my experience with like my grandmother or growing up with my parents, like my young. So I was just,
once they knew you were one of the good ones.
Yes. So then they would say racist shit around me, forgetting that I was Black.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's. Is there an example?
It was something along the lines of like, okay, so it was a lot of Black lives. So when I was still, I still do colleges, not as much, but like at the height of it, like the height of me doing colleges and him being a nominee was also the big conflict about Black Lives Matter. And so it would be a lot of like jabs about Black Lives Matter. And then like, saying, well, we got to really support our cops and our police and this and this and that. And so they would like say things like that around me that I just would like shake me. Like if I was in New York City, I would have a rebuttal, but I would just be like, oh, okay, cool. Because I know that by the conversation that you're not that smart. So it's not even worth my time to even try to break it down. But they would say things like, oh yeah, let's see how they would feel if we didn't have the police and they were just going to keep killing each other. And I'd be like, what? Okay. Like people in Chicago.
God.
For some reason, this was like also when everybody was like sorry about Chicago, but not really. But whenever somebody brings up Chicago and I'd be like, oh, once I hear you say Chicago and we're in North Dakota, I'm like, oh, I already know what this is. Never mind.
Do you know J.L. Covan, the comedian J.L. Covan?
Yes.
His Trump impression is the best. And when he does Trump, he refers to black people as Chicagos. The Chicagos, they're very, because it's like exactly what you just said. And it's just always the example, because you hear of the black on black gang crime there, and that's in specific neighborhoods, and people always really cite that.
Yeah, and it's like, I know you're not really concerned. Like, to me, like when I hear people talk about Chicago and black on black crime, it's the same thing when I hear people argue about like body positivity and Lizzo. It's like, you don't really care. Like, you don't really care about the well-being of black people in Chicago. You're just using it as an example to further your agenda. Just like, you don't really care that Lizzo is a big girl. You just don't want big people to be confident. Like, it's just like, I see right through that.
You brought up body positivity. Let's get into some more specifics about your book, which you and I have been trying to connect and have this conversation. And we tried to do it the other night at the Comedy Club. We tried to do it yesterday. Now we're finally doing it. But the cool thing is, it's gotten, I've had more time to read the book. And I just have to say, I really, really like this book, and I have so much admiration for you writing it. And you did a lot of research. Of course, you spent a long time as a journalist, but I mean, to be a journalist and a comedian, it's the perfect type of person to write a book like this. I think that I like to think I know a lot of things, or a little bit about a lot of things, I should say. But I felt very enlightened in reading your book, and I also think it's really brave the way that you write about the things that you do write about, and you're so vulnerable in this book. And a lot of it does have to do with body and body image and diet and nutrition, and you go into all of it. So congratulations on it. Everybody should buy this book, no matter who you are. If you have body image issues, if you don't, if you've dieted, if you've not, if you're white, black, male, female. I'm a skinny white guy, and I loved this book because I just felt so enlightened, and it's really funny and very honest. You talk about sex and sexuality, and a lot of you cover it all. So anyway, done with the compliments, but I just wanted to give a specific plug there.
Thank you.
You start this book where as a young girl, you're eating a bowl of oatmeal. And your mom, it was at a time where we really didn't know it nearly as much as we know now about the dangers of processed food and sugar. And even if we did, obviously cost matters. So take me back to when you were a little girl, and when the kind of things that your mom fed you, and the kind of things that you ate, and your relationship with food and where it began.
Yes. So the interesting thing is, my mom took great pride in not allowing me to have fast food. So I went to McDonald's like once a year. It was never like, oh, Mom, I'm hungry, let's go and stop here. The only thing I was really allowed to get outside was pizza, because that was like something that she couldn't make at home. And so because of that, in her mind, she thought that she was giving me a solid diet, because I wasn't eating fast food or junk food. But then at home, I would still have processed food that was bought. So I was a big cereal fan and drink whole milk. I would put it like this. I was so addicted to milk, whole milk, that if my mom made pancakes and there was no milk, I wouldn't eat the pancakes, because I always had to have milk with something sweet.
Wow.
It was a cookie, cake, anything sweet. I had to have a tall glass of milk, and I would have a fit if there was no more milk. And so when I was a kid going to school, we would always have cereal. During the cold months, we would have oatmeal or cream of wheat, and it always had to be chocolate flavored cream of wheat or maple brown sugar oatmeal. And then on top of that, it would be, to mix the hot with the cold, it would be added cold milk on top of the hot oatmeal, and then a pat of butter. And because it was maple and brown sugar, I had to add my own chocolate syrup to it. And that is what I would eat before I would go to school. And then if it was cereal, just cold cereal, it'd be cornflakes, because cornflakes were healthy. And then she would add like a tablespoon of sugar, whole milk, and then cut up bananas. And then I would eat that.
So, I mean, it's fascinating, and people listening, can totally relate. It's like this: you think that you're eating healthy. It's almost like, I mean, you know more about nutrition than I do, but it's like a very healthy, nutritious salad covered in ranch dressing, which I found out has sugar in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Or
also
a
my
baked
mom.
potato covered in butter
Yeah.
and sour cream. I mean,
And the
it's,
other thing is my mom was fit. My mom was thin. She was naturally thin her whole life. And so in her mind, she wasn't associating that with me blowing up in weight. You know, it was just like, all right, she's going to complain if I don't give her, like she was giving into what I wanted, basically. It was like, if I don't put this, you know, chocolate syrup, she's not going to eat it. And then she's going to waste the oatmeal. So it was like, let's not waste the food. Here's some chocolate syrup.
and where were you guys socioeconomically in terms of, you know, the kind of food that you could afford?
I would say definitely lower class. You know, both parents worked and she cooked every day. So it was always like, you know, rice and beans and chicken or, you know, fancy. If you had fish, we would have fish maybe like once or twice a week. Sunday dinner was still like the biggest meal. We'd go to my grandmother's house and she'd make a big spread. But we were very, you know, very modest income. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy. But yeah, it was always whole cooked meals at home.
But I mean, you make this point in a lot of different ways in the book. And a lot of people, either they realize it at this point or they don't know it, or they just want to ignore it. But the less money you have, the harder it is to eat healthy, period.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
And
Yeah.
so people that are living with, you know, with less resources, and also, you know, probably most likely, people always think this horrible, horrible myth that if you're poor, it's because you're lazy. The truth, of course, is poor people work almost always the hardest, but you don't see them. You see the ones that are, you know, that you think are lazy. You hear about them and you think that's representative of most lower income folks, but that's a complete canard that lives at the very tippy top of bullshit mountain. You're working all day. So it's like hard to eat healthy. And it's hard to make healthy meals, and so you end up eating fast food. But the bottom line is, if you can't afford healthy food and you're eating processed food and fast food, you're more likely to have health issues, period. I mean, what would you add to that?
Absolutely. And the thing that I realized in my research, doing my research, shout out to Monica Wilder, who was my researcher who helped me with this book. I wanted to make sure that all of my stuff was correct as a journalist. Like that was like my nitpicky thing. And she definitely assisted me. And so during our research, I realized that there are a lot of emotional and mental issues that are attributed to a poor diet. And, you know, scientific studies have shown that a poor diet can lead to behavioral problems and emotional problems with young kids in school. And so that's another thing that we don't even really break down, because if you admit that food and what is being processed can impact those early stages of child development, then those companies would have to pay for that or admit that and change what they're putting in the food, and they would never do that.
I mean, it's a really important point. It almost never gets made as well. So let's continue. I mean, when did you start to get bullied? When did you start to be seen as, you know, not within the norm in terms of the way that you were growing taller and heavier, gaining weight? When did people start throwing food at you as you write?
Yeah, it was almost instant. And I think it had less to do. So when I first started school, I started kindergarten at the age of 4. I was gifted, and my birthday's at legit the end of the year. It's December 28th. And this is before they did the cutoff in like August or September. So if you were born in 1980, everybody went to school at the same time.
Yeah,
and
I was not to interrupt you, but my birthday's Halloween, and I started kindergarten at 4 too, but I was not gifted. Like, it was not good for me.
Yeah.
I felt like I was always a bit behind, not to insert myself, but I'm glad.
No.
I mean, I'm glad that was the case for you, because it could be really a struggle. But anyway, you were gifted, and even though you were 4, you started early, and so.
Yeah, I started early, but I was emotionally, like how you felt, that's how I felt emotionally, because there's a certain level of naiveness that I had, this certain level of just gullible. I was just gullible and vulnerable. I also was an only child. I was the first grandchild on my mom's side of the family. That's where I stayed the most. So I didn't have older siblings or cousins to, like, you know, beat me up, not like literally, but like prepare me for social interactions. I didn't have any of that. I just went from being around adults to other kids. And so socially, I was already a misfit. And then I was the youngest. So emotionally, I just didn't get a lot of things. And then on top of that, I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. So that means culturally, I wasn't in the know about like the lingo, the slang, the fashions, the clothes. Like I didn't know the music. So it was so many strikes against me. And then on top of that, I started gaining weight. So I started gaining weight probably about like first, second grade. And that was after being in this environment with, other kids and being bullied and just internalizing my feelings and eating a lot of junk. And then also I wasn't physically active. My mom, I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. I didn't have a lot of kids to play with. It wasn't like I was running around and going to the park. We didn't really have that. And the Jewish kids didn't really play with us. So it was a lot of things. It was like the perfect recipe for just like being bullied. And once I started being bullied for all these other things, and then the weight got added to it, it just made it worse. And the messed up thing about it is like I was with the same gifted and talented kids from kindergarten until 5th grade. So it was the same kids every year that bullied me every single year. And they always found something. So it was like nothing was ever going to be good enough. I could lose weight, but it was still, oh, you from the Jewish neighborhood. Or if I was acing every test, it was like, oh, you still don't know how to dress. It didn't matter. It was like I was just the whipping boy.
So how come, if that was the case, and I read that, and you write about that, and it's painful to read, and you say it here, and it's painful to hear. But then now I know you, and you're so confident and so smart and so funny. Like, how did you become this Chloe Hilliard, who's now written this book and done so much in your career? Most people would be destroyed by that early childhood experience. That was it would be so traumatizing and so deeply so difficult. How did you end up having so much confidence now as an adult woman?
I think I have to thank my parents. My mom did an admirable job with me. She always told me that there's certain things you can and can't control, but the things that you can control, you should take great pride in. And so I always knew that I was smart. And I think that was like my saving grace. It was like, you can say anything you want about my physical body, but I know I'm smart and I know I'm talented. I know that I can do anything I put my mind to. And also when I was going through all of that, being bullied in school, my mom always supported me. She always stood up for me. If she had to come up to school because of, I got into a fight, she would say, well, what did they do? She never sided with the school because of something, because she knew if I lashed out, it was because of something. I never started a fight. And so that she was my biggest advocate. And so that just taught me that I need to continue to stand up for myself because nobody else will. And it will be to the point where like all the teachers would be against me too, because it was like, clearly you're the biggest person in this scenario, Chloe, you must have done something wrong. And I just always had my mother who believed me. And so I think the confidence came from her, and it came from me knowing that I was, always able to speak for myself. I was always able to advocate for myself. I never shied away from that. And as I've gotten older, I just been able to communicate those things. And then what happens is, because of my physical body, as far as like being taller, I can also therefore start speaking up for other people, which is why I always wanted to be a journalist. Because in my mind, I was like, well, I know what it's like to not have a voice. I know what it's like to be overlooked. I know what it's like to be treated like shit. So I wanted to advocate for other people. And that was like my mission being a journalist. If you look at like some of my works that I did at the Village Voice, I'm like always focusing on the marginalized, the obscured groups, the people who were pushed away, looked over, victimized. I was always wanting to speak for those people. And then when it got to comedy, it was like, well, I've done this for other people through journalism, but now it's time to do it for myself. Now I get to tell my story. Now I get to speak up for myself. Now I get to explain and contextualize why I am the way that I am and my viewpoints. And then I realized that other people, one, are entertained by those things, and two, they relate to it. And then I realized that I'm not alone. And so that gives me validation, knowing that the life that I thought was so isolated and singular is actually more in common. And I think in writing the book, that also proves the point, because now I'm meeting so many people who are like, I too had the same experience with food and body image and diet and weight and self-esteem.
It's so interesting to watch you doing stand up. I'm always interested in watching stand-up comedians relate to the audience, or even more interested to see the audience relate to the comedian, because the comedian's experienced, the comedian knows what to expect, but the audience doesn't. And women on stage, much less, or even myself as a white guy, like you walk up there and they decide everything about you and what you're about to say based on, your gender and the color of your skin, your age, and it's really interesting. And you plow right through that. Immediately you connect. It doesn't matter. And you kill the whole time. But one thing that was really, and I was telling my wife about your act on our walk yesterday, and it was really fascinating to see. You'd have this long bit, and I'm going to get kind of the premise wrong, about women and gender equality, and if only women would have started biting men's dicks off earlier. And yes. It is a really very intelligent, smart, thoughtful joke that you wouldn't think maybe when I describe it, but help me, explain the premise of that joke, because that joke is fascinating for the simple fact that that the men in the audience are are in pain every time you mention biting off a dick, and yet somehow we are still laughing. That's a very hard thing to pull off. What is the premise of that?
So the premise of it is when I first started hearing about the Me Too movement, I read an article, which is true. I read an article and the woman said that her boss put his penis in her face. And my instant reaction is, why didn't you bite that dick off? Because in my mind, as someone who's trying to protect myself, I would have bitten that dick. Like, logically, that's the only thing I could have done. And so I realized that other people didn't think that way. And then I had to ask myself, well, why do I think that way? And then it ties into, having been a former athlete, playing with men, not being a damsel, having a larger body. So physically, I can do things that other women don't do, or I do things that other women don't think to do when it comes to protecting themselves, because I've interacted with men in the physical game of basketball. And so I don't subscribe to being like a princess, and so I think that ties into like society's norms. And I break down like why we have to stop calling young girls princesses, because then that means that they're always waiting for someone to save the day. And then when you talk about gender roles, it's like, well, men always think to beat somebody up because that's all the imagery that they've been shown since childhood, which is be a soldier, be a fighter, be a warrior, doing hand-to-hand combat. But women don't have that. So because society subscribes soft and pink to women and, soldier green to boys, you find yourself in a situation where your boss pulls his dick out and you don't know what to do except for cry and crumble, or not tell anybody, or, call out from work sick the next day, when you could have just bit that dick off. And then instantly he would have been guilty and you wouldn't have to explain anything, because why was his dick out? I've told
my daughters, and I don't know if you think this is a better idea. I think biting the dick off it's violent, it's permanent. The dick has to be in the mouth. So I don't know what you think, but I've told my daughters to if they're in a similar situation, grab the bag, grab the scrotum, and do your very best to pull it up over their face. What do you think?
Yeah, anything. But I think it's just the idea of women need to not freeze in those situations, because that's the thing that men anticipate. They anticipate that a woman is not going to defend themselves.
Well, I think, but what I'm hearing is, it's really interesting, is the reason why, and I don't want to blame any victim here or anything, but it's about your experience. Anytime you're in any situation, much less one like that where you're being sexually assaulted, your reaction to it often probably has a lot to do with your life, how you were brought up. And because when you describe your interactions with men on the playing field or on the basketball court, and the physicality of that, not to mention your size, your height, and so on, it brings about a different reaction than would somebody who was always kind of brought up as being tender and a princess. Am I getting it right? It's like, it has lot to do with your life. I mean, if you were went to martial arts or self-defense class, you're probably going to be reacting a little bit differently in that situation. But then again, if you're in a position of inferiority at the job and it's the boss doing it, you might have the instinct to bite the dick off, but you're like, well, if I do, it's going to ruin my entire career for the rest of my life.
Absolutely. And I also end it by saying, like, I'm not advocating for physical violence, but I'm just saying that in those situations, women, we should think first to defend ourselves than to not defend ourselves. And however which way that is, however you feel comfortable defending yourselves, every single reason why bad behavior like that goes unchecked is because the person who's being victimized didn't have it within them to act in that moment. And then it becomes a story.
They didn't.
Yeah, no, yeah. It just becomes a thing. I'm just saying that in this day and age, we are well aware that inaction makes it difficult to defend yourself after the fact, because then it's a court of opinion. And I'm just saying, let's eliminate that extra step of a court of opinion, because physically you've proven that something happened in the moment.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and a lot more to be said about that, and we could talk about it for a long time. Last question that I want to get to, which is beauty standards. You have a chapter in your book titled "Fuck Kathy Ireland," who I had a poster of growing up. I mean, she was one of my earliest fantasies. Sports Illustrated, supermodel Kathy Ireland, and this chapter is about beauty standards. It's about body shape. It's also about skin color. And, I've thought a lot about that. I can't relate to it at all, but I really have thought a lot about, certainly when we were growing up, a lot has changed, but the people that we would see on TV, the dolls that would be available to be sold to us, the color of their skin and the shape of their bodies were predominantly white and skinny. A lot has changed, but what did that do to generations of Americans of color before, when they didn't see somebody that looked like them, that was considered beautiful? You also have this really interesting chart of People Magazine's most beautiful people, and there's only a few of color, and only one is a dark-skinned woman, Lupita Nyong'o. I mean, and it's a fascinating chapter and a really important, I think, dive into beauty and how we have conditioned to see beauty.
Yeah. Yes, I know. So the interesting thing about that chapter is I hope that it encapsulates what the experience is for a young person of color, having to be thrown images about European standards of beauty. And the interesting thing is, some reviews that I've gotten, reader reviews, like this one white woman was like, "This is the most racist book I've ever read in my life," because of my depiction of that chapter. And I'm thinking, how could you make this about you? How did you make this about you? This is about a young Black girl's experience with self-identity and race. And if this wasn't your experience, just like when you asked about what do you say when someone says the N-word, or someone says that something's racist, just acknowledge that that's that person's experience. Don't try to police it or minimize it because it makes you uncomfortable, because then you have to realize that your experience, like I said, your experience is not the norm. And so
that's very hard for people to do. They don't even realize they're doing it. I'm not giving them the benefit of the doubt, but they we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to Kathy Ireland, I think she's probably a really lovely woman. I've never met her, but it's just about what she represented. And this was at the height of, the early supermodel days, and everything was white and thin and, skin and bones. And I just felt very let down, because not only did she not represent me, but she didn't represent any of the women in my life who I thought were absolutely stunningly beautiful. And so where was the validation for those women who were clearly gorgeous, but they weren't pretty enough to be in the pages of the mainstream magazine? And so then,
in college, I had a roommate who was a Black guy from the Bronx, and I had a big poster of Elle Macpherson. And he said, I remember a number of times, that she wasn't attractive, that she was too skinny. Mm-hmm. And I just remember having just completely not comprehending how you could look at her and not think she was perfect. Yeah. And I finally figured out that his picture of beauty was massively different than mine at the time. But it was a really interesting experience to have that. I'm like, what do you mean? That's the Sports Illustrated swimsuit model. She's the cover. How could you look at her and not think that that's perfect?
Easy.
Yeah, now I know. But I didn't then.
Yeah. And also, I think when you say, so when you have like, if you're a person of color in this country, you have a dual citizenship. You have to know everything about white America, and then you have to, and then you know everything that is natural to your own environment and your community. And so this is before social media. This is before cable. So whatever was on the major networks was all that we saw. And so when you realize that if you're a Black person like myself, I know a lot of like corny white facts because that's what was around me. I know all of the shows. I know all of the songs. Any Bon Jovi song come on, I know all the lyrics because you had to know that because that was the dominant culture. But it never works in reverse. So I have to know everything about your culture and the mainstream society norm, which is, presented as if this is everything about America. And you don't have to know anything about my culture or my community, which is why you don't see us and we're not visible and we're not in the mainstream.
That's such a really important point. And the only thing I would add to it is I just remember, I want to say early 90s, must have been early 90s, seeing the film Boys in the Hood and thinking, and then reading a little bit about it and going, oh, that's a place in America?
Yeah.
And just having my mind blown. And then that's, I think, probably where my curiosity began. But watching that movie, I was like, what? That was the first time I'd ever really, seen that type of neighborhood depicted, because I certainly hadn't been to that neighborhood and known anybody from that neighborhood. I will not take up any more of your time, but I could. I am so enjoying learning from you, reading the book and hearing your experience. I love talking to you. I love working with you this weekend. You are a killer on stage.
Thank you.
And whatever happens next, it just keeps getting better for you because you're so talented and so intelligent. And I love talking to you, and I hope that we can do it again and again and work together again, because I really enjoyed it. You're brilliant and hilarious, and you just own that stage like very few comedians that I've seen. And really, at a with half the experience, you've been doing this like 10 years, and it seems like you've been doing it 30. Congratulations on all your success and the book, and I hope that everybody will buy it. Fuck your diet and other things. My thighs tell me. Chloe Hilliard, and all of that will be in the links and the show notes, and follow her on Twitter. Yeah. Chloe, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, I really enjoyed talking with Chloe. She's really, really funny. You should see her live on stage, and her book is really enlightening and educational, and you should read it, especially if you're not a Black woman. Is that provocative? I don't know. I've always had an affinity towards, I think, people of color in general, especially women of color, since I was very little. When I rode a school bus with a Black girl named Kim, who I sat next to a lot, and she was really nice. I remember her being really nice, and I just think I developed an openness towards Black people when I was really young. And my mom had friends that were Black women. She taught in the public schools, so she had a lot of students that were Black and brown, Hispanic. And I would go and I would work with them, and they would come to our house on holidays at times. And my mom was just always talking about them, and so I just was very sensitive to the struggle and discrimination, and then college. But I've always, I don't know, if this is wrong, and, it's generalization. I think I mentioned it, about just sensing how much more difficult it is for women, and understanding that, how much more difficult it is for people of color. And I know some people sometimes think that sounds virtuous. I'm trying to sound better or something. It's such bullshit. That's just the case. It's about, you can be sensitive and thoughtful and knowing, aware of the history and current day kinds of discrimination and hate and racism that we have, and sexism. So anyway, thinking about that first question I asked her about Black girl magic, and I looked it up, found a couple of articles I wanted to mention. At Huffington Post, they write, it's hard to nail down a definition, we'd say black girl magic is a term used to illustrate the universal awesomeness of black women. It's about celebrating anything we deem particularly dope, inspiring, or mind-blowing about ourselves. And it's interesting in the history of black girl magic, the phrase, they say don't bother trying to look it up in a dictionary because it isn't there, at least it's not there yet. But we're sure you've seen or heard the phrase plenty of times over the past year and wondering what it means. Well, it was created by Keshawn Thompson to celebrate the beauty, power, and resilience of black women. And boy, are we glad that she did. Since that moment, the hashtag Black Girl Magic has taken over social media platforms. And then I asked what black women on my social media thought on Twitter. I asked the question, dear black women, how do you identify with, appreciate, or define hashtag Black Girl Magic? And I got like 5 responses from black women. Cool. First one, Black Girl Magic is a celebration and recognition of our gifts and talents that we won't or don't receive because we are black. At Author Spice writes, I was given a gift of writing. I used it to spread truth, wisdom, to shed light in the darkness, to inspire and encourage. Writing heals and triggers change. This is my purpose and why I share. That's my hashtag Black Girl Magic. Edie answered on Twitter with, it's embracing who we are and can be despite centuries of being told we are not blank enough. Oh, that's good. And a scorching, concise, very great take from my friend Pat McKay, who I worked with at SiriusXM. Pat writes about Black Girl Magic, all that we represent as tangible and exceptional about the victory that is our everyday life. Since you asked, love. Pat, thank you. Thank you to all those responses. Very interesting. I'm going to keep being curious, keep inviting powerful, smart, hilarious, triumphant black women onto this show. So let me know who you'd like me to have on. Moving on to another post on social media about healthcare. I went out with my new friend John on Wednesday night. Dropped my 14-year-old Ava off at her 2 hours of dance, which we haven't had to cut yet. Cut some of it, though. They took more classes, but got to cut back and be realistic. They're cool with it. It's all right. But we haven't had to cut it all yet, which is not something that we want to do. And I went with John to P.F. Chang's to have drinks. And I don't care what you think about P.F. Chang's, okay? It was just a place to have drinks. It was open and it was near the dance studio, so that's where we met. I like their food, so as well. Anyway, I had a Sapporo, had a beer, and over some appetizers. We talked about our common shared misery and anxiety, frustration over the fact that we'd both lost jobs that were really good jobs that were also jobs we liked. And at the end of the hang, I'll call it, John mentioned, oh yeah, now you got to get health insurance on the exchanges. And like me, the family of 4 in his situation. And it's awful. It's awful. This country is horrific for a lot of reasons, sexism and racism, but our healthcare system is beyond embarrassing. Every rich nation has rampant inequality. They all have plenty of bad things in their society and their governments, corruption, like I said, racism, sexism, inequality. And some are worse than ours, but we're alone in our shittiness when it comes to the healthcare system. I mean, really. My worst fear about losing my job when I had the job was losing the great health insurance that I had for my family. I know so many people and heard so many stories over the years, people in my life, people who called the show, who had no insurance or were underinsured or had to claim bankruptcy because of medical bills for themselves or their loved ones. It's absolutely an embarrassing injustice. And now my fear is realized, and I am so far from alone. John and I were talking about it. And by the way, we're healthy. We have a lot of resources. We don't have any in my family chronic illnesses. or expensive drugs that we need to pay for. This country is an embarrassment for a lot of reasons, but the rest of the world is so much better at distributing healthcare. Who's to blame? Greed, capitalism, right-wing myths and red herrings about the causes of it all? So go out and vote for any Democrat you can and thank Barack Obama and Democrats in the House and Senate when he was the president who put the priority on regulating the insurance industry. That's one of the things that the right-wing media were so good at demagoguing. Well, healthcare in general, right? It's going to be a government takeover and government doesn't do anything and you're going to die and not have healthcare and it's going to cost so much more because so much horse shit they threw up against the wall. Day in and day out, repeating it over and over and over. And it was effective. But come on. This is crazy what's wrong with our system. So many different things. Anyway, a lot of people responded to my rant about that on my Facebook page, Pete Dominic on Facebook. And I wanted to read some of those responses. Derek wrote, 45,000 lives lost a year in the richest nation in the history of the world because we decided they are unworthy of medical care solely because of their income. Disgraceful. Tim wrote, I used to call your show while I was driving my pharma territory. You are absolutely right, Pete. The game is rigged for profits at the expense of American lives. The fact somebody can't understand that is frightening. Now I work on the save healthcare money side and my soul is growing back nicely. Good luck to you, friend. You're in my thoughts. Keep up the exercise for the time being. Tim, thank you. A lot of responses on this Facebook post. Which are the best ones? We go over to Twitter. There's some really good ones there. Joby writes, yeah, I get to pay $220 for physical therapy today so I can have the use of my left arm again. Yay. I have had to hit the deductible of several $1,000s so some empty suit can buy another yacht or whatever. Dave wrote, yesterday I stepped on a rusty nail while uninsured. Oh man, sorry, Dave. He said, I couldn't remember when my last tetanus shot was. The minimum I found at urgent care was $250 Luckily, I called my old doctor. He helped me for $35. Thank God it wasn't a major emergency or I would be pooched. We need Medicare for all. Dave, thank you. Gianni on Twitter writes, at least New York State offers subsidies based on income. In Florida, you can't obtain insurance. I've been screwed for over a year. Horrible system. Ironically, I hold a master's in healthcare admin. LOL. Sandra, I don't know how it's pronounced, but she writes, I work part-time because I'm hobbled by arthritis. I just lost my state coverage because I make $27 too much each month. I still can't afford coverage, and I'm still hobbled now without means to get the painkillers, not opioids, that get me through the day. Where's the healthcare, question mark? Alec. My new friend Alec, at Alec Peters, writes, been self-employed for 21 years and have never been happy with our system. And a lot more replies on that tweet, which read, the American healthcare system is a horrific embarrassment. We should hang our heads in shame for allowing this to continue. Health insurance is by far the worst part about losing my job at a company. Hard enough to start your own thing without this beast on your back. So check that out on Facebook and Twitter, and let me know what your healthcare nightmares are. Clayton says, we have insurance through my wife's work. We still pay $800 a month with no copay and $7,000 deductible for three of us. And I feel pretty fucking lucky compared to my brother. $1,200 a month with $10,000 deductible for his three. The whole thing blows donkey dick, Clayton writes. And Rob, all right, I just read this final one. Rob writes, if you were building a healthcare system from scratch and someone suggested what we actually have now, they'd be thrown out a window and pissed on while falling. Yet, here we are, pissed on while falling. Rob, I've never heard that. That is harsh. But I do have frequent urination, I think, as a result of my anxiety, so I'll pitch in. All right, you pitch in. Let me know what you think at standupwithpete@gmail.com, on Twitter @Pete Dominic, and you can reach me on Facebook at standupwithpete. Message me there. Your healthcare night, your situation. How are you getting health insurance? Send me whatever your thoughts are, and we'll keep going. Sure, we'll have a whole series on healthcare. Plenty to talk about, and obviously we'll get our friend Dr. Aaron Carroll on. By the way, if you're missing Aaron Carroll on the show, definitely check out his YouTube page where he has almost 350,000 subscribers. Healthcare Triage, where he explains a lot of the problems with the healthcare system, nutrition, and other medical myths. And of course, you can read him in the pages of the New York Times Upshot. He's my main source of information on our stupid, broken healthcare system. Check out a series where he compares other countries. Really good stuff. All right, that's all for today's episode of Stand Up. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your support on Patreon, patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Tomorrow night, Charleston, South Carolina. Last chance to get your tickets. Looking forward to seeing, hopefully, some of you there. And I will talk to you on Monday right here on the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a rating or a review if you haven't done that yet. Now is your opportunity. Bye-bye.